epithelial tissue, though it had many different types, there wasn't a lot of diversity. We were looking at either simple or stratified, squamous or columnar. Connective tissue is going to be much more diverse. Connective tissue is the most diverse and widely distributed tissue in the body. It contains cells, fibers, and a ground substance. The functions of connective tissue include binding, supporting, and protecting the other tissues and organs. We've gotten used to seeing very organized cells up to this point. Our epithelial tissues were side by side, all standing on a basement membrane. Connective tissue, it just looks like a mix or a mesh of different cells all crammed together. For every type of connective tissue, we are going to see a resident cell, the cell that is there in the highest number. For example, adipose cells are going to be the most present cell in adipose tissue, providing us fat, insulation, energy storage, a reason for liposuction. But those guys are all, that's what they're there for, right? So we can get rid of them. But they are going to be that resident cell in that tissue. Other things present are going to be protein fibers. Connective tissue, depending on the type, might have varying amounts of these three. Some might have almost none of the others. But they include elastic fibers, collagen fibers, and reticular fibers. So we'll see different percentages in each type. They also all have a ground substance. The ground substance, you could think about that as, for a lot of it, it might have like a gel-like consistency. So you could think of it like making Jell-O, and that would be your ground substance. And then you would add to it some strings, that would be your fiber, and then you'd throw in some cells. That combination is what makes up connective tissue. But the Jell-O, the ground substance, it could be calcified like bone, it could be liquid and be blood, or it could be a gel and be cartilage. So we're going to see that ground substance change depending on what type of tissue it is, but it's always present. So those components that we just went over are cells. Each class of connective tissue has a specific cell type. Plus, there are often immune cells located there as well. They have protein fibers, which are filaments that strengthen and support connective tissue. Types are collagen, reticular, and elastic. A ground substance, which is a non-cellular material that contains the cells and fibers. It can be liquid, semi-solid, or solid. The ground substance plus the fibers are called the extracellular matrix, meaning everything outside of the cell that supports those cells. Now, this picture looks kind of messy, but what we would see is there's different fibers going on. There's cells. These are adipose cells since they're large and round. And there's a ground substance that all of this is present in. So this would be an example of connective tissue. Because it is so diverse, its functions are just as diverse. You can see protection. That comes from the bones and also the cushioning of adipose tissue, of fat. It protects your organs as well. Bones provide support and structure to the body. Structures are connected by ligaments and tendons. You have some joints that they're primarily held in place by tendons. Adipose cells, they can help us store energy. Calcium and phosphorus can be stored in our bones. And it helps with the transport of oxygen and whenever we're talking about blood. So these are all functions of connective tissue. Connective tissue all originates from mesenchyme tissue. It is going to be embryonic connective tissue that's present in the embryo. Feel an urge to sneeze. It's like it was almost there, but it's not quite. Maybe it'll go away. So mesenchymal is a gel-like ground substance with a few fibers spread throughout. And mesenchymal cells have the ability to become any of those cells that we talked about with the connective tissue. So in the body of an embryo, we would find mesenchymal tissue, and over time, it could develop into bone. If those cells become osteocytes and build a bone out of the ground substance, it could become a blood vessel. It could become adipose tissue. It could become cartilage. But all of that can originate from the mesenchymal tissue. From the common origin, we see three different broad types of connective tissue. Connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue. These are the three main groups. I think on our chart, no, they don't show this grouping. They just show the names over here on the right. Each group has two main categories. We're going to go, each one has its own slide. So we have loose and dense. We have cartilage and bone, and blood and lymph. So let's go meet those. All right, loose connective tissue is going to support and surround. It is your classic packing material. Whenever we ship something, we use little air bubbles. When your body wants to package something, it uses loose connective tissue. Your organs are very important and we want to protect them. So some of this material is just the thing. With loose connective tissue, we don't have a lot of fibers. There's more ground substance than there are fibers. So it's going to be a little bit looser. Whenever we go on to the dense one and the next one, that one's going to be mostly fibers. So you'll see a big difference. The first type is areolar. Where can we find it? Just below the epidermis, forming that dermal papilla. That's going to be your areolar. It's going to bind the skin to deeper tissues. And we also have some organs that we're going to surround with it. The cells that we see in this tissue are fibroblasts. And they're in there producing the collagen fiber and the elastic fiber. And there's a good amount of ground substance in the background here. Now, when we are young and our faces are wrinkle-free, we have a lot of elastic fibers and collagen fibers, and our fibroblasts are just working nonstop, making us beautiful and smooth skin. As you age, this part of the body can kind of break down a little bit. We might have fewer fibroblasts, so we have fewer fibers. They get a little stretched, and that's when your skin begins to wrinkle or sag a little bit. These fiber and elastic, because collagen fibers and elastic fibers are not as strong as they used to be. And you might not have as many fibroblasts. Next up is adipose tissue, where our primary cell is the adipocyte. Now, these cells are packed full of energy in the form of lipids. It insulates, it cushions. And your body's goal in life is to produce as many of these cells as it can and get them as big as it can. And we provide a lot of good food so it can do that. That's the tug of war. But the reason why we have those adipocytes is that your body always thinks you're about to go into a famine and it wants to be ready. So it's continually storing lipids inside of these cells. They get so full, it pushes the nucleus over here to the side. And pretty much it just becomes full of lipids. So looking back at our cell animal model of last week, that was not an adipose cell. That would just basically be a sack of fat. Reticular tissue is a little bit rare compared to the others. I mean, we found adipose cells all over the body. Reticular tissue is going to be found in the spleen and in the lymph nodes. And it's mostly made up of reticular fibers. It has a ground substance, and it has a lot of white blood cells or leukocytes located there. That's the place where you're going to find all of those reticular fibers in big numbers, in your spleen and in your lymph nodes. All right. So loose connective tissue has some fibers, a lot of ground substance, great for packing. Dense connective tissue, it is going to be primarily fibers. It is there to support and surround. It is called, basically is made up of collagen. And it's mostly avascular, meaning without blood vessels. The first type is dense regular. Dense regular is named because of the density of the collagen fibers. It is basically, it's 99% collagen fibers with a tiny bit of ground substance just visible, and a few nucleuses crammed in there too from the fibroblasts, but they are surrounded and squished in between the collagen fibers. We want to have very strong ligaments and tendons in our body. They help us create our joints in certain cases, our shoulders and our knees. If you look at the skeleton, there is no good articulation between those two. It is primarily muscles, ligaments, and tendons holding it together. They have to be very strong, and we help that by having all of them in the same direction. They have a regular pattern that provides more strength whenever they are pulled on. In comparison, dense irregular is going to be a somewhat random, haphazard appearance to those collagens. It still is good at resisting stress, but it's not as strong as the dense regular was. We find this in our skin dermis and covering the bones. Once again, there's large amounts of collagen fibers, not a lot of ground substance, more than with dense, and we do see fibroblasts in here as well, which are helping to make some of that. Elastic connective tissue is going to primarily be composed of elastic fibers, and these allow us to both stretch cells and recoil them. The place that you find this is in the walls of elastic arteries like your aorta. The aorta is a very large, very strong artery, but because of the high volume of blood that gets pumped out of it with each heartbeat, it has to be able to increase in size as that blood volume passes through, and then be able to shrink back to its normal size. Stretch, shrink, stretch, shrink. If it loses that elasticity, it could burst. That concludes the connective tissue proper of loose and dense. Now we have the supporting connective tissue. All right, supporting connective tissue begins with cartilage. Cartilage allows for physical protection and support and consists of a semi-solid extracellular matrix. The cells that we're going to see in all three types of cartilage are chondrocytes. And the chondrocytes are cells located inside of a structure called a lacuna. A lacuna is like its own little protective bubble in that semi-solid extracellular matrix. So when you see a circle with a white ring around it and then a little pink circle inside, right here would be the chondrocyte, and this would be the protective lacuna surrounding it. Lacuna, chondrocyte inside. Lacuna, chondrocyte. So in all the different types, that's a lacuna, chondrocyte. You see that in cartilage. The first type is going to be hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage provides support, and it is pretty much found all over the body. For this one, we say the nose, the growth plates, your larynx, but you're also going to see this on the ends of most of your bones. And even in between your ribs and your sternum, we have some of this cartilage, so it shows up often in the body. Under a microscope, it has an almost glassy appearance with its individual chondrocytes and a lacuna. Next up is fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is cartilage plus fiber. All of these collagen fibers running the same direction are providing a lot of support to this cartilage, making it much stronger. And we need this one to be strong because we are going to place it between the vertebrae. And every time you jump, every time you carry something heavy, and just the day-to-day stress of trying to support your upper body for 50 years, 60 years, 70, we need to have very strong pieces of cartilage doing that job. That is our fibrocartilage. Elastic cartilage doesn't have to be as strong. It's not going to be weight-bearing of your entire upper body. Instead, we're going to find this in our external ear. Elastic cartilage helps maintain shape, and it's full of elastic fibers forming a web-like mesh with some chondrocytes packed in there. Now, all of these elastic fibers, they have limits. If you've seen anyone who has gauges and they've gotten larger and larger, and they take them out and the ear just kind of hangs there, that was you stretched your elastic fibers past their breaking point. But your ear normally would have that nice external ear would be elastic. There's a syndrome called Marfan Syndrome. And this is a rare genetic disease that affects your connective tissue, resulting in less elastic fibers throughout the body. Now, this is caused by a genetic mutation, and whenever one of the main things that we're able to see visually of someone with Marfan syndrome is they are taller and slender. They have long arms and long fingers. They are often nearsighted, because we do require elastic fibers to help us with focusing with our eyes. They might have a curved spine. And this can be a life-threatening thing if, because there is less elastic fibers, their aorta is stiffer than mine or yours. And in that case, whenever all of that pressure is being put on it, if this person happens to have high blood pressure, that might just be too much for the aorta and it can burst. We need those elastic fibers being produced by our body. Next up is bone. Bone is a supporting connective tissue that provides physical protection and support, but has a solid extracellular matrix. The cells are called osteocytes. So bone provides us with not only support, but it also helps us as a lever. We can use our muscles to move our bones in different directions, allowing us to have movement. Also allows us to stand up. But anytime that you find bone, you find it in the skeleton, and it is going to be a calcified matrix with osteocytes. You see osteocytes right there. They look a lot like the growth rings on a tree as they go around that opening in the middle that the blood vessels are located in. All right, the last type is fluid connective tissue. Primarily blood. Blood allows us to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout the body. We find it inside of the circulatory system, inside of our blood vessels. And what we have is a liquid ground substance with formed elements. That's our special word for red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. They're all traveling through the blood. Now, this blood plasma, this ground substance, the plasma itself sometimes will leak out of the blood vessels in order to carry nutrients to all of the tissue cells. But say if 10 ounces comes out, only 8 ounces gets reabsorbed. So those extra ounces that get left behind in the body, they get absorbed by a sewer system called the lymphatic system. What comes out of the blood vessels is full of nutrients, but it's just going to be the ground substance only, the plasma. When that gets absorbed by the lymphatic system, it's just going to be a clear, colorless liquid. And sometimes you will see, basically think of like a sewer system. You might see bacteria, decomposing cells, some degraded material, but you're not going to see the red blood cells or the white blood cells typically in the lymphatic.
The next tissue is muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is going to be specialized cells that contract when stimulated, producing movement. The function is movement, both voluntary and involuntary. Skeletal muscles are the example of our voluntary muscles. These allow for movement, and we find them attached to the skeleton itself. In shape, they are long, parallel cylinders with a lot of striations. Nucleus are present, but they are kind of squished to the outer perimeter of the muscle cell due to the inside being filled up with the contractile elements. When we see skeletal muscles, they are very straight, as in this picture. They don't branch, they don't change, narrow and widen. Cardiac muscle, on the other hand, is going to be a muscle that does not attach to the bone. It's only present in the heart, and it involuntarily, without your conscious control, will contract and pump the heart. It's located in the heart walls, and because there is no bones to attach to, the cells attach to each other. They do this at special joints called intercalated discs. Striations are present, and the cells also branch. A big difference from our skeletal muscles. Smooth muscle is going to be involuntary, and it propels material through your organs. We find it lining the walls of hollow organs, especially those that are going to be a tube shape. These are short, spindle-shaped cells with no visible striations, and when they contract as a whole, they can narrow the diameter of a tube, allowing us to propel material through that tube or to mix or churn it, maybe even to create a sphincter and close off a section. So there's a lot of control there, but we don't see like the skeletal movement. The last tissue is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is located within the brain, the spinal cord, and in the nerves itself. The function of nervous tissue is to receive, process, and transmit nerve impulses. They are supported by special cells called glial cells that act as nursemates for the nervous tissue. Here's a picture of a nervous cell. We're going to see a neuron here on the right. And neurons actually have all of these short little branches, extensions of their membrane called dendrites that bring in input, and then a single long axon that carries that input away to communicate with the next neuron. The glial cells are going to wrap themselves around the axon, and they'll wrap themselves around the neuron body just to support it, provide nutrients. These cells are very large, they don't regenerate, so these are going to last you your entire life. In review, tissues are a group of cells that perform a common function. We saw epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. Each one had very different functions, We saw protection and lining with the epithelium, absorption, diffusion. Connective tissue was packing material. It was transport. It was bone. It was cartilage. It was everything. Muscle allowed us to move. It beat our heart. It moved our internal organs. And nervous tissue allowed communication between all of these different organs. We have finally got to the level of organs. Organs are two or more tissue types that work together to perform a specific function. A good example is the stomach. The stomach is an organ, but it consists of epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue, all working together. The next slide is going to show us a section of that stomach wall so we can look at all four types. On the very innermost open to the lumen, we find the epithelial tissue. It is here they're producing mucus, they're producing different acids, they're working on secretion. Below that, there's a layer of connective tissue. That's where our blood vessels are located. It's going to be dense, irregular connective tissue. We have nerve cells running through as a nerve plexus. And then we have 3 layers of muscle tissue, followed by a little layer on the outside of epithelium. This slide just gives us a little more detail about what tissues specifically are present. Most other organs also consist of 2, 3, or 4 of these tissue types, all working together. The last part on this chapter is going to be a couple of slides over body membranes. Body membranes are formed from the epithelial layer bound to the underlying connective tissue. So we look at these together. These membranes line body cavities, cover your organs, and cover the body's surface. The mucous membranes line internal passageways open to the external environment. Your oral cavity, your airway passages coming through your nose, reproductive, all of that's going to be a mucous membrane. Serous membrane lines closed body cavities and covers the organs. We saw the serous membrane for the heart, the lungs, the abdominal organs. It just reduces friction. Cutaneous lines the external surface. It's a lot like the mucus, but instead of having a mucus wet surface, we're going to have a very dry protective surface of that stratum corneum. Synovial is going to be a membrane that lines the capsules of your synovial joints. Those are what joints? Synovial joints would be the very movable joints, like your knee, for example. We're going to line them in order to help reduce friction, provide that same slippery substance that we saw with the serous. And with that, we are finished with this chapter.